Welcome back. This is module 8. Today we will start with module 8. Module 8 is the last module of this course. Now, so far in the course we have seen through all the 7 modules different aspects of language and society interaction, how different kinds of social variables are reflected through language use and sometimes even constructed by language use. And now we will move on to some of the latest new and latest domains of investigation within this language society interaction from a cognitive perspective. This is one of the more recent perspectives that we have, and where we have lot of new kinds of evidence that is coming in from cognitive science, from neuroscience and similar backgrounds. So, this is again a roadmap of the module. Lecture 1, that is today's lecture, we will look at what is collective cognition, social cognition, collective cognition, what are the different markers, or how do different societies differ in terms of apparently what might be a socio-cognitive parameter and so on. That is what we will discuss today, and eventually similar kind of topics we will take up in the next 4 lectures as well. So, supracultural models, social cognition in discourse, cognitive sociolinguistics is a new and emerging field. We will have a brief discussion about that as well, and the last lecture will cover social neuroscience of language, social neuroscience and language of language, where social psychology, cultural psychology and cognitive neuroscience have come together, and together they are trying to look at how language structure as well as language use can be understood from these perspectives. So, this is what the module is all about. So, today we will start with lecture 1 and look at collective cognition. Of course, there are multiple there are nuanced divisions even within this, but here we are more interested in giving a brief overview. So, we will stick to the broader categories. So, from linguistic behavior to language processing, this is where we are going. So far we have looked at the macro view of language, macro as in the way the communities of different groups, different communities, sometimes even different social categories behave through their linguistic output. So, what kind of language structure, speech norms and so on and so forth exist. So, that is what we mean by a macro view of language, where we are looking at the behavior, linguistic behavior of a group or groups within with respect to language. Now, we will move on to social categories and processing of social information in interaction. So, when we talk about processing, we are going into the cognitive domain. So, what happens in the mind? How do you cognize? How do you understand the world? How do you understand? How do you create categories in the world, and how language seem to have a strong interaction with those things. So, the starting point as a result of this and this discussion will be what we call social cognition. Now, what is social cognition? Broadly, this can be called the adaptive process that emerges from the interaction between the agent and the world. So, agent as in the human agent, the human being. So, when you are looking at cognition at an individual level, it refers to the person, a singular person, and the way he or she looks at the world, and how that can have reflection in the different kinds of output, linguistic output included. But when we are talking about an agent and its interaction with the world, and that kind of an very often that also includes an adaptive process. So, that interaction and the simultaneous adaptive processes are what are the within the purview of social cognition. Because the reason why it is such a smooth transition is possible from individual to social cognition is because cognition is for action. When we try to make sense of a new experience, when we whatever we understand often goes through stages. So, we have whether it is bottom up or the top down approach. Let us say if we are looking at the bottom up approach, there is an incoming stimulus that we will process, and depending on how, and then there are some top down variables there, what we want to do with that incoming stimuli, and then depending on that we process the information in different ways, and then eventually that processing will lead to some kind of action planning. So, we want to do something out in the world. So, we plan the action, maybe some verbal output, maybe some sensory, some kind of motor output, all of that planning happens and eventually we have the output. So, there are stages. Now, most of the time when we are doing any kind of such processes, it is because there is a follow up action on that. So, that is what we mean by cognition is for action. And where does that action take place? Between individuals or sometimes between an individual and the environment, the society. Environment means society, the culture, the groups within which we are situated and so on. So, cognitive processes or cognition in a more simpler form in cognitive psychology has been associated primarily with mind and mental activity. So, what do we mean by mental activity? These are the things that we do in our mind. These are the primary, these are some of them are higher mental functions. So, we have attention, memory, executive function, language, action control, all of these things are part of what we call cognition or cognitive processes or mental processes. Now, when we talk about cognition, there are of course multiple ways that this is a very nuanced domain where multiple ways or multiple types of opinion exist as to the nature of that process. What is the nature of the process? How does cognition really happen? Now, depending on what the process is, what you focus on, there are multiple schools of thought. So, the classicism, that is the initially the symbolic cognition, that viewed cognition as a symbolic system. So, this is in a sense going back to the mind body dualism. So, the brain works as purely in terms of the logical processes. So, it has nothing to do with the experiences. And then there was the theory of connectionism that viewed cognition as emerging from interactions among networks of interconnected processing units which are called neurons. So, the brain cells, neurons. So, the way they are connected, the kind of connections that form also over time, this is the whatever we do, whatever we understand is a result of those interconnections. That was connectionism. Then comes embodied cognition. Embodied cognition primarily refers to the interaction between the human mind and the environment. So, we understand certain things because we have experienced them. Something that you have not experienced ever, your understanding of that particular entity or experience will be less adequate or less appropriate. That is what the embodied cognition means. The cognition arises out of the experiences, the lived experiences, embodied experiences, and hence the name embodied cognition. And there we also have social cognition. Social cognition, this is action and activity that is socially situated. Now, we might even argue that all actions, all activities are actually socially situated, and you will be right if you say that, because many scholars have even went to the extent of saying that all cognition is social cognition. So, you cannot take society out of a human being's understanding of himself, herself, or his or her surroundings. Now, this is a simplistic way of looking at how cognitive processes work. So, this is how the environment, the signals from environment first are detected by the senses, that leads to what we call sensation. On the basis of sensation, we create perception. Now, sensation might be same, but perception of the same sensation might be different depending on the individual, depending on the social group, cultural group, and so on and so forth. That is why sensation and perception are not the same thing. Sensation is the raw data. Perception is what you make out of it, that is the basic difference. And then responses will be planned and finally output will be initiated. This is a very simplistic way of how the information processing and the resultant action happens. Now, mental processes are important in social interactions as well, and the study of study of information processing within a social setting is broadly what is understood as social cognition. So, a subset of this entire process that concerns social stimuli, social decision and social response. So, these are the areas that are primarily studied within social cognition. So, this is how it has been defined. Again, the goal of social cognition is to provide mechanistic, process oriented explanations of complex social phenomena. That is how social cognition is understood. There are many other similar sounding or similar domains within alongside social cognition. Before we get into the data and the examples, we will talk about them as well. So, another similar understanding, similar category of within the broader cognition is called distributed cognition. Now, this has roots in the mid 1980s. So, for many people distributed cognition means cognitive processes that are distributed across the members of a social group. You see how it is similar to social cognition. So, the group as a whole, they behave in a particular way, the group understands things in a particular way. So, when cognition has in certain kinds of mental processes, so that certain kind of mental process, let us talk about perception. What do we perceive as a good behavior, good, you can put it in quotes. So, what is considered a good behavior in a particular society may or may not have an exact replica in another community. So, that is what we mean by this. So, the cognition is distributed across the members of the group. Now, the question is how the cognitive processes we normally associate with an individual mind can be implemented in a group of individuals. That is one of the primary questions that has been investigated over a period of time. One of the parameters that has been studied extensively is the domain of memory. So, memory is often treated as a socially distributed cognitive function, and this has been studied not only in linguistics, but also in sociology, anthropology and many other such domains. So, there are some examples, these are some scholars who have talked about it. For example, Durkheim and colleague has talked about memory as it could not be coherently discussed as a property of an isolated individual. So, memory can never be an isolated individual's property. It is always situated within a particular given scenario, within a particular given background. That is how they look at it. Roberts on the other hand talks about social organization could be read as a sort of architecture of cognition at the community level. Similarly, Schwartz talked about distributional model of culture that emphasize the distribution of beliefs across the members of a society. So, when we talk about let us say cultural norms, cultural cognition, these are very easily understood as markers of distributed cognition. Whatever the cultural norms are in a given society, in a given backdrop, it is always shared by all the members of the community. So, that is often how we understand this, and this is exactly what the scholars are talking about. Similarly, you have March and Simon who argued that organizations can be understood as adaptive cognitive systems. Organizations also. Rather important name in this domain is that of Marvin Minsky. His Society of Mind is a very well known book in this regard. So, his work can be juxtaposed to Vygotsky, for example. So, while Vygotsky's Mind and Society describes mind like properties in social groups, Minsky explores how the language of social groups can be used to describe what is happening in mind, right. So, society of mind, the mind itself it can be understood as as forming a society. So, Minsky argued that to explain intelligence we need to consider a large system of experts or agencies that can be assembled together in various configurations to get things done. So, he proposed as a result he proposes a two-layer system. A higher level agency could be composed of lower level agencies. So, each brain contains hundreds of different types of machines interconnected in specific ways which predestine that brain to become a large diverse society of partially specialized agencies. So, this is how Minsky looked at it, this is how he looked at the human brain. So, this means that the cognition of an individual is a distributed cognition as well. So, it is not only in the outside in the society, but the single brain of a human being can also be understood as comprising of larger and smaller level agencies who all do their own work, and collectively finally they create the output that we typically see. So, this even not only at the social level, but even at the individual level we can understand this as a distributed cognition. Now, we also have the dimension of culture. The moment we talk about society, the moment we talk about the broader backdrop, we are talking about culture. So, culture has been cognition, culture interaction has also been studied by many important scholars. So, how they interact with each other, and in turn both of them how they interact with language, that has been studied a lot. So, it is often seen, cognition is often seen as an aspect of culture. Thus, culture influences various cognitive processes because of the differences in the way you will look at the world. Culture specific ways of looking at the world automatically tends to have some amount of interaction with cognition per se. And that is one. And on the other hand, Sperber and Hirschfeld they describe this process along two important dimensions. One is the very existence of culture is both an effect and a manifestation of human cognitive abilities and processes, and simultaneously the human societies of today culturally frame every aspect of human life, especially that of cognitive ability. So, language, cognition, language and culture, culture and cognition, all of these diverse entities have been understood and studied from because of their interactions for a long time now. It has been few decades. So, that brings us to the language and cognition relationship. So, what kind of relationship does language have with cognition, at what level? Most of their studies with respect to language cognition interrelation goes back to Chomsky's work, where he talked about the complex mechanisms of the human mind that is at the back end of what the process called language. So, he was the first person to talk about language being genetically pre-programmed for humans, and that is why his theory is called nativism. So, his idea of innate mechanism is called nativism. Now, his theories implicated a separation between language and cognition in certain domains, though he put language firmly within the mental domain in terms of the brain has a particular, the language is resides in the brain, humans are born with it, but then at the same time there was no connection that was proposed in terms of the embodiment. The cognition that he talks about is symbolic. Language processes also are symbolic. The universal grammar is also symbolic processing to some extent. So, eventually there were many more theories, many more disciplines, subdisciplines, subdivisions that came up, all of whom looked at this question from different kinds of perspectives. For example, connectionism looked at it, cognitive linguistics looked at it, and even cognitive neuroscience movement also discussed about language cognition interrelation to a large extent. So, connectionism looked at the idea that sophisticated computations emerge from massive networks of simple processing unit, in which units are akin to idealized neurons. So, basically it argues that intelligent behavior emerges from interactions among many interconnected processing units. So, early success came from a model that learned English past tense forms, capturing both regular patterns and irregular sub patterns. So, how does today, of course, we have come a long way in artificial neural network and other models, where we see how language learning can be actually done by machines and how effective they are. But these are data from older times. Cognitive neuroscience, again this emerged from neuroscience and cognitive science with the aim of explaining complex cognitive abilities in terms of their neural basis, and here also they looked at the language as one of the important components. Cognitive linguistics has language at the core alongside cognitive processes and other factors. So, this emerged in the 1970s out of dissatisfaction with the formal approaches to language, to unify language and cognition and to explain how meanings are created. So, while Chomskyan linguistics did not initially, at least did not forefront the meaning, the syntax was paramount, but cognitive linguistics put meaning at the center to understand how language works, and as a result of which how the human mind creates meaning or how meaning gets reflected through the structure. So, this is how the difference was. So, this is the knowledge of language is no different from the rest of cognition, because this is just one part in the larger network of cognitive processes. So, that was a significant point of departure between cognitive linguistics and the formal linguistics. Now, we have of course, Humboldt, Whorf and Sapir, all of these great people have and their work have significantly contributed. Now, within this domain, embodiment is a central idea. Embodiment, as we just saw, embodiment refers to the lived experiences, how you lived, what you know, what you understand, what you have experienced has a role to play in the way we create meaning or express meaning, convey meaning and so on. So, sees language as a reflection of the embodied cognition, which serves to constrain what is possible to experience and thus what is possible to express in language as well. So, this is language acts as a window that enables direct investigation of conceptual structure and conceptualization as a process. So, the starting point for cognitive linguistics is conceptual structure. How do we conceptualize things, and which has a direct relationship to meaning. So, languages are not the same, but studies demonstrate that languages can exhibit radically different conceptual organization and structure, and this area of study tells us that different languages have different ways of even fundamental experiences of life like time and space. They can be conceptualized differently across cross linguistically or cross culturally. So, that is where language, conceptualization, cognition, they all come together. So, language as a, now we can understand this as a product of collective interaction. So, Hutchins for example claims that interaction give rise to novel structures that cannot otherwise develop in components or in individual parts. This is very interesting, because when we look at language in terms of social cognition, cultural cognition, the use of language in terms of as an outcome of interaction between the speaker and the hearer is given a lot of importance, because we create the process. It is possible that some people use language in a particular way within a closed circle, and eventually it goes into the broader social domain. So, that is how it is. Sometimes changes also happen, new structures also are given rise and so on and so forth. So, Freud for example talked about some of the features of language that are identified as linguistic universals could arise out of the necessity of sharing the linguistic code. Why do we have linguistic universals in the first place? What if we are not born with it, but because it came out of a sharing of the linguistic code. Similarly, Minsky and others argue that symbols tend to emerge at points where communication is constrained or restricted. Hutchins and colleagues are also have looked at Freud's claim that linguistic structures emerge from interaction and communication pattern, and they developed a robust procedure as well. They used the connectionist networks in which shared lexicon emerges from the interactions of individuals. Later they found the emergence of reduced conventional sequences of lexical items as well. So, likely the beginning of syntax. So, basically these findings point to the fact that interactions are important in terms of creating or changing the structure of language in certain cases. Thus, though language helps in creating and exchanging meaning, language alone cannot guarantee that. Language is not a fixated thing. It is based on it is dependent on the people who use that language. So, though yes, language is something that we use as a tool, as some scholars have called it a semiotic tool. So, we use it as a semiotic tool to use to create meaning and to exchange meaning, but then that also depends on the users who must take an active part in the process, which means interaction. So, when we interact and we play our part in the entire process is when meaning generation and meaning exchange becomes an important factor, and which is the core of social cognition. So, here we are moving from individual to collective cognition. So, traditionally Western psychology has mainly focused on cognition from the perspective of the individual, not collective, not so much. Scholars of social cognition have mostly examined perception, processing, representation of social, initially of course traditionally, and representation of social information only of individuals. However, some scholars later argued that it should also be studied as a group level property, as a result of which it has become now it is widely understood that collective or cultural cognition needs to be studied, and it emerges through interaction between members of a cultural group across time and space. So, it is not just in time or just in space, but both. And this obviously for doing all of this, language has to be has to play some important role. So, meaning thus is central to social interactions, and language is a tool that helps in that process. This is how this has been put forward. So, language is most productively conceptualized as a semiotic tool, namely a tool for meaning making and meaning exchange in imagined or real social interactions. It is not only the real life social interaction, but also in imagined social interaction. So, as a result Holgraves and Kashima, actually they give a model of how this probably works. We see a society, we see a language, and how we try to understand how it works in that particular society. But how did it come to be that way is what they are proposing. They propose a 4-layered or 4-stage model. This is the model from their influential paper, where they say that these are the stages through which it goes. So, speaker and listener cooperate with each other to construct a particular instance of language use during their social interaction. That starts with some individuals, some tokens of a particular type, right, and this particular instance of language use affects their cognition. That happens at a very micro level, a small level, 2 people, 3 people maybe. Eventually what happens is this use may be so prevalent that it can be understood as part of the totality of the language system. So, what starts as a mutual understanding between speaker and the addressee, and by using a simple a new kind of a language use, then particular instance of language use, and eventually when it goes into the broader social domain, that is when we find it as a significant aspect of social cognition of that particular community. So, at this point, at the last stage, language system can be said to influence the social cognition of its users. That is how they put it. So, these are the stages, and of course, they discuss each of the stages in detail. We will not be discussing all of that, but this is how they put it. So, the progression from stage 1 to stage 4 is played out over time, obviously, because this kind of changes take a lot of time, from going from one person using a particular peculiar way of using language, and then it becoming the accepted in the society, takes a lot of time. So, while the first 2 stages take place in what they call micro interactional level, and it takes place over short terms. The last 2 stages, that is the collective effect and the language as an abstract symbolic system, to work to the for that particular use to go to this level, it needs a broader time horizon compared to the micro level, and leads to abstract notions of language influencing social cognition through linguistic practice. So, over a period of time, through more and more interaction, that is what we mean by practice, more and more interaction, more and more let us say reiteration of that particular structure, then we move from speaker and recipient to the broader social domain. So, he talks about the authors talk about speaker effect in terms of decision making, storytelling, and then recipient effect in terms of all these, and then eventually moving to language as an abstract symbolic system. So, at this stage when we study many of the languages, and we find that okay, this is very interesting in this language, that is interesting in that language, and so on. This is the last stage. This is when the system has already crystallized. This is when it happens. So, basically, so representation, processing, and application of social knowledge is how many scholars define social cognition. Thus, cognizing the world around us happens not only at the individual level, but also at the social level, and this gives rise to what is also known as cultural cognition. So, we have already dropped many kinds of names. So, we have social cognition, cultural cognition, distributed cognition. At some level there is a lot of similarity among them. Of course, there are some subtle nuances, shades of nuances, differences as well, but broadly there is a lot of similarity. So, people use schemata to organize their understanding and experience of themselves, other individuals, social roles and types of events, and so on and so forth. And this is essentially emergent. This is what we saw just in the previous slide. So, this is essentially emergent. It is the property of the entire system is not the sum total of the individual's concept. So, there are certain things that emerge over time, and not everybody might be having all of these at the same time. So, this is what basically it means. So, that takes us to the domain of what we call cultural cognition. It has two intrinsic aspects, cultural conceptualization and language. So, how a particular community, particular group, cultural group understands certain things and how it is reflected in their language, that is what we study. So, how we construe aspects of the world, also called the worldview. So, this is where Sapir-Whorf hypothesis also comes in, that languages and then the structures might have a role to play in the way we look at each other. So, thinking about thinking as well as emotional experiences, all of these are studied within cultural cognition. So, lexical entries in the language are dependent upon the cultural conceptualization and are a sort of labels for the same. Hence, lexicon is also called the memory bank for concepts that are culturally constructed. For example, Aboriginal English in Australia embodies the Aboriginal cultural schema. So, even though the language is English, the cultural schema has some inclusion from the local, the Aboriginal cultural schema, cultural way of looking at it. So, that idea, the conceptualization gets into the language that they speak, even when the language is an outsider language, it is English. So, where do we see this? The word mum for them refers to anyone who is culturally in the same category. So, it is not just the mother. The word for mother is mother, but then in this community many other beyond the actual mother, there can be many other people who fall in that same cultural category. These categories, so kin relations are a very specific culture specific categories of understanding the world. So, in this case not only the mother, but also mother sister falls in the same category, which can be denoted with the word mom. Similarly, home refers to wherever their extended family members live. So, it is not only that house where they live, but also all those places where the members of their extended family live. So, that is what we mean by cultural cognition. The language is different, but the cultural conceptualization gets into the language that they use, even when it is their second language. Let us see some more examples. Korean and Ymatsil language. So, Korean language is very interesting in terms of their understanding of space, the objects in space and the space itself. So, the way the way they create the words for understanding the relationship between two objects in space. So, for example, they have this tight fit and loose fit kind of a relationship. So, for example, in English, if you can put a hat on your head, you can put a ring on your finger. In many cases, the word on can be used, but in Korean it is not. It is a little more complicated, because in Korean you have to distinguish between whether something is tightly fit or something is loosely fit, and depending on that the words will change. This is a simple example of how languages might look at something otherwise objective experience into different categories from one another. Similarly, this Ymatsil language has been studied extensively by Stephen Levinson and colleagues. So, where they look at the way the directions are understood in their community. So, they rather than strictly sticking to the cardinal points of the compass like north, south, east, west, the terms in this language encompass quadrants which often roughly corresponds to the points of the components. So, 4 quadrants are based on the earth, as an absolute frame of reference. So, basically what happens is many of these languages they have a what we call absolute frame of reference. Absolute frame of reference is where irrespective of the speaker's location and orientation, the objects that he or she is talking about have nothing to do with the speaker's orientation or location. Their locations are understood in terms of some fixed bearings. It can be a sacred hill, it can be a sacred water body, it can be the sea, it can be the sun, something like that. So, similarly, this language also has that kind of, it is not exactly the corresponding to the cardinal directions, but something similar. So, this is how they designate location of an object in space irrespective of where the speaker is. The opposite way of looking at this kind of arrangement will be the speaker's orientation, which is called the relative frame of reference. Relative frame of reference is when I will designate the location of the object depending on my location and my orientation. So, right now certain things, so this certain things are in front of me, so the audience is in front of me, the board is behind me. But if I turn around 180 degrees, then the board will be in front of me, the audience will be behind me. So, here it is the location of the objects or people in space is dependent on my location, my orientation. That does not work that way in this particular language. So, this is another case of how the language and the cultural conceptualization go hand in hand, and which can be very different from other languages. Another Australian Aboriginal language has a class of prefixes that are called classifiers that are obligatorily used with all nouns. Now, depending on the class of nouns, they will be using a different classifier. As we can see, this is the list of classifiers which go with different kinds of nouns. So, Kardu for example goes with Aboriginal people and human spirits. Then another Ku with non-Aboriginal people, Kura for potable fluid, like this it goes. It is a long list of prefixes that are attached to nouns in this language. Now, given the particular classifier that is used, you understand them to belong to one particular category. So, this is how they understand, and not only that they have categorized objects into different kinds of categories based on their worldview. Sometimes this is also fluid in the sense that, for example, they use the boomerang. So, boomerang when it is used as a, this is the ideal purpose of a boomerang. Of course, the primary purpose of a boomerang is as a weapon. So, when they use it as an offensive weapon, it gets this particular here you see, this is the Tu is the prefix for weapons, offensive weapons. So, when boomerang is used as a weapon, this is the prefix that they use, but when it is used as a back scratcher, that is when they get the prefix Nanti, residual category, that includes whatever does not fit in the above 9 groups. So, this is a very completely different way of looking at the world. So, this is where you can see how language and cultural conceptualization go hand in hand. Similarly, the use of plural marker to sound honorificity in certain languages. So, similar grammar cultural conceptualization found in many languages, but Persian is one language where they have an extensive use of different kinds of pronouns to mark the honorificity, honorific aspects of that particular community, various kinds of. So, for second person, third person plural is used, for example, plural pronoun Shoma is used for as a second person singular honorific, third person plural is used as third person singular honorific, and so on. It is like the tu vous distinction in French. So, even when you are talking about, you are talking to your addressee is a single person, ideally you should be using singular number, but we use vous to show honor. Metaphors are another domain that has also been studied with respect to how culture specific ways of understanding the world has been expressed through language. Metaphor is such one domain. One of the areas is, of course, one of the areas of metaphors is body based metaphors. So, you broke my heart in English indicates heart as the seat of emotion, but not all languages have the heart as the seat of emotion or the seat of the endearment. That is not how always it works. Some languages have a different way of looking at it. Hindi, for example, Hindi has jigar ka tukda, which is typically referred to as somebody who is very close to you. Children are typically referred to as jigar ka tukda, but jigar is not heart. Chinese, the word shen refers to faculties covered by both the heart and the mind in English. So, in English heart and mind are different things, in Chinese the same term refers both of them. So, these are different ways of looking at the world. Here the idea is that Chinese philosophy has a different take. Heart is the organ for thinking, feeling, will, reason and intuition. So, this is because of the underlying philosophy, that is why the language also treats the both heart and mind in a similar way. Cultural schema of self is also very interesting domain within this broader domain. Again going to Persian, this has also been studied extensively. When they are talking about to refer to being humble, they call it shekaste nafsi, reflects an important cultural schema in Persian, refers to the speaker in a communicative scenario reflecting his humility. So, when you are referring to yourself as somebody who is very humble, you are trying to show your humble self, that is when you use this kind of word. Often when one receives a compliment, it is politely refused, saying the person does not deserve it. Play it down, return it to the complimenter and so on. It is believed to have originated from the Sufi concept of these three kinds of ego. So, ego with pride, admonishing ego and ego free from materialism. Three kinds of ego that Sufism talks about, and this is the idea that probably got into Persian language in terms of how do you see yourself, where do you see yourself in that list. So, the ego is always with battle with the lower aspects and trying to achieve the higher planes of being. Now, though Sufism is not prominent anymore, but the idea has remained in the language, and also because many writers and the like use Sufi conceptualization in their writing, hence this has been etched in the cultural ethos of the Persian people. So, these are some of the examples that you see from where cultural conceptualization of something as simple as self also can be different from culture to culture. Persian stands out as a very important through their ideas. The idea that they give is very important and very different from other languages. So, on the other hand, the word for self is khud. So, on the one hand we have seen ego, there are three kinds of ego, where the higher ego is always trying to fight with the lower ego and getting to the higher level and so on. And another word for self is khud. Now, all the words with khud are typically they have a negative meaning. You see, khodbin is conceited, khodparast is selfish, similarly khuddar, all of these, many of these words are there in Indian languages now, Hindi Urdu has, except khud sakte, that is different, but self made, this is the only positive word with the word for self, that is khud. So, everywhere else all the other words that are used with khud that are created with the word khud are having negative. So, basically taking yourself giving more importance to yourself is not understood as a positive thing in this culture. So, to sum up, language leads us to the way a community understands things about the environment and its people. Thus, language may work as an indicator of social and collective cognition. So, this is where we complete our lecture 1. In lecture 2, we will look at some other parameters within the larger broader understanding of social cognition and language. Thank you.